where population is heavily deviating from GTO, and we're basically going to be talking about how we can exploit these common spots to gain the maximum amount of EV. I have spent a lot of time over the last few weeks combing through 2 million hands played by population, and I believe this is the most comprehensive mass data analysis on the internet right now in 5-card PLO. And today I've got 5 spots where we can capture EV that we would not be able to capture where we play in just a solely GTO based strategy. So without further ado, let's get into number 1 and number 2. First up, we're going to explore how we can adjust our strategy when we know that population is playing a very, very unbalanced check raise range on the flop in single raise pots. So as discussed in the intro video to this series, in order to effectively exploit population in spots where they are deviating from GTO, we first need to have a general understanding of how we should approach these spots in theory. So firstly, we're going to have a look at how the in-position player is supposed to construct their c-betting range in single raise pot in terms of GTO. So after being checked to in single raise pots, the solver wants to c-bet a very polarized strategy. So basically what this means, in other words, is they only want to put hands into their betting range that are happy when they face a check raise. Basically hands that have an easy decision playing versus a check raise. To demonstrate what I mean by this, I want to use this King 7-5 two-tone board as an example. So we basically raise the button, get called in the big blind checks to us, and both of the hands we have here, we have very easy continues versus a check raise. Therefore, we have an easy decision when facing a check raise, making us a happy hell move. So if these hands are our polarized value hands, what kind of hands do we want to use for our polarized bluffs? Well, in the same way that we have easy decisions versus a check raise with our value hands, our polarized bluffs have easy decisions when facing a check raise, in that they are easy folds to a check raise. So these hands generally are going to have like nice blockers to our opponent's continuing range and not that much playability in a check back line. In terms of pot share, I think it's pretty clear why these hands have more EV in a bet line than a check line, because when we check back, it's going to be very difficult to realize our equity with these specific hands. Therefore, facing a check raise with these hands also kind of makes us a happy hell move in that we know exactly what to do. So this just leaves us with the middling parts of our range, where if we bet and get check raised with a hand like naked top 2 pair or bottom set without backup, a GTO opponent is going to be pushed to indifference with these sorts of hands, meaning that the EV of calling and folding are basically going to be the same. So c-betting these hands and getting pushed to indifference by a GTO check raise range makes us, yes, you guessed it, a very sad hell move. So now when we look at the out of position player's response to a c-bet, we'll see that they will also kind of follow this GTO framework. So they are also check raising a polarized range, meaning that they only really want to check raise hands that will have easy decisions and not be pushed into indifference when the in position player decides to 3-bet the flop. So after check raising hands like this from out of position, for example, we have very easy stack off decisions versus the in position player when they decide to 3-bet the flop. Therefore, we are a happy hell move. And basically, for the same reason that we see bet hands with good blockers and bad playability, we check raise hands like these two combos. They don't have great playability in a check call line, given their blockers and equity, but they do have some very good blockers to fold the in position player out of some equity, and we can actually push many of his combos to this indifference. And so when we get 3-bet on the flop with these combos, we just have very easy folds. Therefore, once again, we are a happy Helmuth. And the solver really wants some slow plays in its check call range with either hands like the top combo here that has the nuts, but if it does go for a check raise, it's going to struggle with playability issues on the turn and river. And also some slow plays like the bottom combo here, this King King 986, where if it check raises, it's blocking so much of the board and the in position players continue in range that we just have too much fold equity with a hand this strong to go for the check raise. So my hypothesis that I'm going to try and prove in the next couple of slides is that population does not have anywhere close to enough of these polarized bluffs on the right. Not only this, but they don't have enough slow plays with strong hands like these top sets in the middle, and therefore we as the in position player need to adjust our c-bet strategy to exploit this mistake and recapture this EV. So to prove my hypothesis correct and to build a counter strategy to this, I combed through my population database in order to find out how they actually play in single raise pots out of position. So first of all, population does not donk enough. So population is supposed to donk a load of strong hands. That's 48% of sets and 45% of two pair on King 7-5 two-tone, for example, meaning that they have a lot more strong hands in their range when they go for the check. So secondly, population simply just under check raises. So population under check raises on every board texture, as far as I can tell, but especially on unpaired boards where it's kind of unintuitive to find these polar check raise bluffs that are going to fold to a flop 3-bet. So this means that when we do get check raised on these unpaired boards, it's much more likely to be a value hand than to be a bluff. Next, population underfolds to flop 3-bet. So we know that population is under bluffing in the check raise line because there is a huge discrepancy between how often the solver folds to a flop 3-bet and how often the population does. So the solver is going to find lots of top and bottom pair with a blocker, top pair with straight draws, and the solver basically uses these as raise folds when they don't have great playability, but population seems to almost always just check call these hands, and sometimes when they do check raise, they even call a flop 3-bet. So lastly, I think it's important to consider that population mostly uses a bigger check raise size than the 75% used in the Sims. On top of their overall check raise range being a lot stronger than in theory, we just get a much worse price to continue if they decide to check raise for full pot instead of 75%. So this basically means that even if they are choosing the correct polarized hands to check raise and fold to a flop 3-bet, because they're using a bigger size than GTO, we should already be over folding to this full pot check raise size. So basically what I would do to work out rough thresholds for defending against a check raise from population that does not check raise bluff enough and who also uses too big of a check raise size is basically just look for hands that are just making a little bit of EV in theory by going for the bet call, and these should be the first hands that we drop from our range that defends versus a check raise against population. So hands like Ace King 988, Yes, it makes a little bit of money versus a polarized range because we're going to have equity against his polarized bluffs. But versus a very value-heavy range, hands like this are actually not doing well at all. Like top pair, second nut flush draw, backdoor flush draw even, we're not doing great. Some naked nut flush draws. These are all hands that we should either check back or just go for the fold when we get check raised by a very value-heavy range. One thing I would also note here is, in theory, the solver wants to check a load of, wants to call a load of sets to the check raise. So like you can see here, when top set gets check raised, it wants to defend with a call 45% of the time. So almost half the time we're just supposed to slow play top set here. But if we know that the out of position player is only check raising a very linear value heavy range, then I would literally just pot every single one of these top set combos, because we can actually push equity and we're not actually going to have a lot of fold equity in terms of when we 3-bet the flop and the original check raiser folds. So that's kind of how I would approach it, picking up these thresholds for this spot specifically. So we know the population is deviating quite a lot in these spots. So how can we adjust our strategy to capture more EV than the GTO strategy? There's going to be two main exploits that I want to go over. So firstly, if we know population are not check raising enough, we can exploit this by betting just a little bit more merged. So the reason that we can do this is because we are not supposed to bet a lot of the middle parts of our range in theory, because if we get check raised by a polarized range, we're going to be pushed to indifference. But if we know the population under check raises, which they definitely do, then we can get value with a lot of hands that we wouldn't be able to versus a GTO opponent. And we can also deny equity with a wider variety of combos in our range. So hands like top 2 no backup, maybe top and bottom with a weak flush draw, these are the kind of combos that we can slide into our merged betting range against these players. Now, the flip side of this is that if we are betting more hands in position, we also have to take into account that population is check raising a much more linear value heavy range, usually for a bigger size, and therefore we want to fold more of our range versus this strong check raise. So our exploit c-bet strategy on King 7-5 is still going to include these strong bet call hands, as well as these easy bet folds. But now we're way more incentivized to play the middle parts of our range more aggressively, because since we know that the out of position player are only check raising a very linear strategy and therefore are going to be lacking a lot of these polar bluffs and including too much value hands, facing a check raise with these hands no longer pushes us to indifference. And therefore, we can now bet much more hands like this for thin value, because we can happily bet fold versus this very unbalanced check raise range that is so popular within the population. Now, I want to be clear, I am not saying that we should bet every single bottom set and every single top 2 pair on these two-toned unpaired boards. I'm just trying to drive home the point that it does make sense to bet a little bit more merged, as population in general is not going to punish us for going for thin value. The third population exploit we're going to explore today is how to play versus unbalanced turn check-in ranges. So how does population play the turn when out of position after the flop checks through? So I'm mostly going to be referring to unpaired boards in these slides, because I think this is where the biggest imbalances lie, but I believe they are unbalanced in this line on basically all board textures. So my hypothesis is this. Population probes turn with too many strong hands. And basically, this leaves their checking range weak and open to attack. And it also allows us the opportunity to go a little bit thinner for value on the turn. So, for example, on this Queen 9 Deuce two-tone board, in GTO, when we raise from the button and get called in the big blind, flop checks through and we see a brick on the turn. In theory, the out of position player is supposed to be checking 1/3 of the top of his range, aiming to go for the check raise.
Ну да,
My hypothesis is basically that
люди
population
поставят
is not doing
видишь, как
this,
сотки.
so I don't have exact stats for hand classes. It's very difficult to filter in this way in Drive HUD, but I would think population checks like 10% or less of the time with these hands. Probably some players never check these hands. Maybe like Queen with the nut flush, they want to go for the check raise with. But I would say almost all top 2 or better are just going for the probe on this turn. Because it's very human to want to put money straight into the pot when you have the nuts and there's so many rivers that can kill your action. So I think people just kind of panic and put way too many of the hands at the top of their range into a probe turn line as opposed to a check raise line. So this basically means that when they do check the turn, a lot of these strong hands are not going to be part of their range at all, and therefore we can really attack in this spot with a delayed c-bet. So a delayed c-bet is basically when we raise in position, flop goes check, the out of position player checks once again in the big blind, and then we go for a bet ourselves on the turn. So now we'll get to some of the important stuff. What does the data tell us about how population play versus the delayed c-bet line? Well, firstly, we always need to know what the baseline frequencies in theory are. So G2O wants the out of position player to fold to a delayed c-bet 45% of the time, but population is already folding an extra 17% on top of this. So they're really over folding in this spot, as well as not check raising aggressively enough. I don't have exact stats for how often they're supposed to check raise a delayed c-bet, but I would imagine it's pretty much between like 11% and 15%, depending on the board. Sometimes even more. So this 5% is definitely too low. So I believe this already actually proves the hypothesis that population is probing too value heavy a range on the turn and therefore capping their range after they check. And we can exploit this by delayed c-betting at a very high frequency, both for thin value and also with a lot of bluffs. So let's use this Queen 9 Deuce two-tone brick turn board to demonstrate. So in GTO, the solver wants to check back these sorts of hands on the turn because when they delayed c-bet and get check raised, they are actually being pushed to indifference. So the solver never wants to bet these types of hands. But if we know that we are not going to get check raised a lot, and they would have already probed the turn themselves with the strongest parts of their range, then we can actually start going for thin value and equity denial with these middling parts of our range, basically turning them from a check back in theory to a delayed c-bet in practice. And not only this, but we can also start bluffing with these kind of low equity hands at an extremely high frequency. This is where the concept of pot share is really important to consider. So with ace 10 7 6 5, with basically no equity on this board, we just have a naked gut shot and the 10 high flush draw blocker. So with hands like this, GTO wants to check back because it really has not a lot of equity compared to its overall range, and it doesn't have great blockers to our opponent's continuing range. But if we know that the out of position player is mostly going to have weak hands in their checking range, then suddenly our incentive to bet a hand like this really skyrockets. So in conclusion, we just want to be a lot more aggressive in theory in this delayed c-bet line, because the out of position player is going to be very capped when they go for a check on the turn after the flop checks through. So experiment with it, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how often this delayed c-bet line works against population. Exploit number 4, steal small pots with small bets. So it's very easy to think that win rates and red line win rates specifically, so that's our non-showdown winnings, come from kind of running big bluffs, doing wild check raises, and playing this kind of style of power poker. And while this is true to a certain extent, a huge portion of your red line earnings are going to come from being aggressive in the spots that a lot of players think are too small to care about. So if we are constantly looking to gain small amounts of EV, which is going to happen a lot more often than in big pots, then very quickly this will add up to a much higher win rate. So that's as long as we know the correct strategy and when to apply pressure in the correct spots. So firstly, to demonstrate, I'm just going to jump straight into PLO Trainer and show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use this Queen 9 deuce board again. So let's say the flop goes check, check. We already know that the big blind is not protecting his checking range enough here. So his range is already pretty weak, and we can indeed go for an exploitative high delayed c-bet frequency here. But we're definitely going to hands that we want to check back, have hands that we definitely want to check back. Basically hands with no blockers, no equity whatsoever, that don't really make sense to bet. Otherwise, we'd be betting our entire range in a delayed c-bet line, and we would have absolutely no hands left to bluff on the river. So we go for a check back here. Let's say it's a brick 7. So what I want to have a look at first here is how often the big blind is supposed to be checking his strong hands in this line. So we already know that his range is kind of being capped by him checking the turn, but by the time he gets to the river, he's supposed to be checking 52% of his sets. So over half of his sets he's checking, including over half of top set. 2 pairs he's supposed to be checking at some frequency. What's super interesting here is Queen 9 is supposed to almost be range checking. I don't think this is happening in practice. Also, like top pair with 2 pair is probably a hand class that he is going to find bets with. I would argue he's probably going to bet most hands 2 pair or better on the river. Definitely not checking as much as he should here. So after he's already kind of filtered out some strong hands on the turn and he gets to this river, he's also supposed to check a lot of strong hands on the river. This is definitely not happening in practice. So my argument here is basically if he's not checking these strong hands, then we just get to bet when check to again for a 3rd time at an extremely high frequency. So if we go half pot in theory here, we can see what kind of hands that this player is supposed to call with. So he's supposed to call with over half of his 1 pair combos. And if you look at this, he's supposed to be calling middle pair or raising it like 80% of the time, 7 to 8% of the time. I think there's very few players that are going to call 9x here. And this is going to make up 36% of his whole overall range. So if he's folding all of his middle pair to a small bet on the river, then we just print money by betting literally any hand that's worse than like probably like king queen. Any hand that's worse than king queen, we can just auto profit by betting the river for small here. So now that we know my hypothesis that verse capped inelastic ranges, we can stab extremely aggressively for a small sizing in these check down pots. But as always, it is important to understand the theory from which we are deviating. So why aren't small in position river bets used in theory by the solver? Well, firstly, it reopens the action. So when we use very small river bets in theory, the goal of these bets is to get very thin value from the weakest parts of our opponent's range. Of course, we're still going to include some strong hands in this small bet range for balance, but overall, we just want to get thin value from the weakest parts of our opponent's calling ranges. Basically, hands that would not call at a bigger size than half pot or 1/3 pot. So in theory, when we use a small bet in position on the river, while we have the option to check back and get to showdown, the out of position player is super incentivized to play a very, very aggressive check raise strategy in this node. But I really don't believe that this is something that's actually going to happen in practice versus 99% of players in the 5-card pools. So the main reason why I think the small river in position bet works so well in practice, in particular in check down pots, but also in bet, check bet, and check bet lines, is that the vast majority of players in the 5-card population just won't understand how often they need to be bluffing from out of position when they see this small river bet size from in position. So I don't have a sim to demonstrate this, but I'm fairly sure if we done a node lock post flop sim where the in position player bets all of his hands that are like weak top pair or better, weak top pair or worse for a small sizing on the river, then the response of the out of position player is going to be to raise at some crazy high frequency, like 25 to 35%, I would imagine. But not only are players not finding these bluffs, they're also overfolding a load of hands that in theory are just going to have to call a small size on the river. So in the example, we saw like middle pair was basically always defending versus a half pot size. If we know that people are going to be folding middle pair for even a third pot, that we're just super incentivized to use this small sizing with the entire part of our range that is not going to win often enough at showdown. The third reason why I think these small river bets in position work so well in practice is that generally in these spots where your opponent's ranges are pretty capped, their calling range is going to be very inelastic. But what does this mean exactly? So we know that population is going to be folding to a river bet in a check down pot 75% of the time, which is already a huge number of in terms of fold equity, no matter what size we use. But if we have a look at how much population folds to different river bet sizes in general, we can see why using this small bet size on the river is going to be so powerful. Now remember that if we bet full pot on the river, we need to win the pot 50% of the time in order to break even. So betting pot on the river as a bluff is already very, very profitable versus population, as overall they fold 71% of the time. But if we have a look on the furthest left bar here, we can see that facing a 25% or less river bet, we're still capturing 60% fold equity, which is pretty insane. Like, for context, when we bet 25% pot on the river, we know we're going to lose every time we are called, we only need 20% fold equity to break even with our bluffs. So if our opponents are folding 60% of the time, we are just giving ourselves an insane price on a bluff by using this small sizing. Now, this chart is only mapping out river fold frequencies versus different sizes in general. So throughout like the whole game tree, 3-bet pots, single raise pots, limp pots, whatever. But I would imagine that if we filtered for betting small as the in-position player and check down pots, given what we know about the capped ranges in play, I think the fold frequency would be even higher here. So it's important to note as a caveat that these numbers could be slightly lower in practice in general, as most of the time when population are facing a river bet and they fold, it's because the player that's betting is going to have some removal to their calling range. So if they have a value hand, they're blocking their calling range, and most of their bluffs that they're using will also be blocking their calling range. But even so, I think this data is just way too far removed from theory that this strategy is still going to work very well. So I quickly want to jump into some hand examples to demonstrate this. So all I've done here is just filtered for hands in which we bet the river in check down pots. So I've not filtered for size